Welcome to biology. In this video, we are going to discuss the parts of the scientific method. I will go relatively quickly through some of these sections, so make sure to pause the video and take good notes. I'm also going to emphasize some of the pieces that students often get mixed up. When scientists use the scientific method, they always start by observing the world around them and then developing a hypothesis. Now, a hypothesis is a possible explanation to whatever question the scientist is asking, but that hypothesis is always going to be able to be tested. Now, in this class, we write our hypotheses as if, then, because statements, and that will become clear in just a minute. Now, an experiment is how you test your hypothesis. A good scientific experiment is done in a controlled manner. And a good experiment only has one variable. Now, a variable is whatever part of the experiment that the scientist is purposefully changing. There's some other pieces to the experiment that you need to know about. The first one is a control group. Now, a control group is set up just like the rest of your experiment, but the only difference is that the scientist is not purposefully changing anything about that control. So let's pretend I want to do an experiment to see if changing temperature is going to influence plant growth. Well, I will set up an experiment where I have my control, which is a plant in the same kind of pot, same kind of soil, same kind of water, same kind of plant, but I'm not going to do anything to the temperature. I'm just going to leave it at room temperature. My experimental groups might have a plant that is 10 degrees above room temperature, and then another experimental group that's 20 degrees above room temperature. The constants are anything that stays the same in all of my groups. So anything that is the same in the control group as each experimental group is going to be a constant. So I use the same size pot. I use the same amount of soil. I use the same kind of plant. I give them the same amount of water. Those things are all staying the same in all of the groups, so that would be a constant. The variable is any factor that changes in an experiment to test the hypothesis. So the variable would be how tall is the plant and what temperature I am exposing that plant to. So those two variables, those make up the independent and dependent variables. The independent variable is what I am the scientist, I am purposefully changing. So they both start with the letter I. It is also the if part of the hypothesis. Going back to that imaginary experiment, if the temperature increases, that's temperature would be our independent variable. The dependent variable is what you are measuring. It is also the then part of the hypothesis. Going back to that experiment, then the plant will grow taller. So independent variable is the if, dependent variable is the then. I remember the difference because your dependent variable is the data that you are collecting, and they both start with the letter D. I want you to pause the video here, read through this slide, and see if you can answer the independent and dependent variable for each scenario. In the first scenario, vitamin C supplements for infant rats result in faster growth. The independent variable is vitamin C supplements, and the dependent variable, or the data that is measured, is how fast the rats grow. In the second experiment, highly concentrated acids result in more serious burns to skin. The independent variable, so what I, the scientist, I am controlling, is the concentration of the acids. The dependent variable, the data that we are collecting, is how serious the burns are. So data is any information that we gather from these observations. And there's actually two categories of data. We have qualitative data, which is descriptions with words. I remember qualitative data because it has a letter L for language. So is the substance hot or cold? Is it red or blue? Is it sunny or cloudy? Those are all using words to describe your observations, and that makes them qualitative data. Quantitative data, on the other hand, is using numbers. Now, quantitative data has the letter N for number. So the plant grew 20 centimeters. The substance weighed 3.46 grams. The temperature was 90 degrees centigrade. Those are all using numbers, and that means quantitative. After a scientist has collected all the data, they need to be able to interpret some kind of trends, and that is the analysis. Essentially, this is kind of the boring part of science, or the math part of science, or the hard part of science. I don't think it falls under any of those categories, but this is where you're looking at your observations and trying to make sense of things. The conclusion is where you put together the patterns and you start to share out your science. So your conclusion is answering your hypothesis using those observations or the numbers or the data that you collected from your experiment. Now, in order for a conclusion to really be trusted and to make sure that what you did is not pseudoscience, your experiment needs to be run more than once. Now, a really, really good experiment, you should be able to send your procedure to another lab, and they should be able to use your instructions to run the experiment, and they should be able to obtain the exact same results. If they can do that, then you know that your results mean something, that they're true, and you made good observations and you did good science. Now, the scientific method is usually written out as a straight line, but that does not actually reflect what is happening in the real world. I like to think of the scientific method as a circle. You're constantly making observations and asking questions and trying to make testable hypotheses and do experiments to explain whatever questions you had. And sometimes your experiment doesn't actually explain what you thought it would explain. So then you have to revise everything and test it again. And if you can keep going through this cycle long enough, eventually as a scientist, you'll develop what's called a theory. Now, a theory is not an educated guess. That's a hypothesis. A theory is a well-tested explanation that unites a broad range of observations. Now, a theory is widely accepted, but not necessarily by everyone. So a theory would be something like the theory of relativity or the Big Bang theory. That means there is a ton of evidence to support this, but there's still a few scientists out there that are trying to explain that same concept in a slightly different way. Now, that's very, very few individuals looking from a different perspective. However, in science, if you are able to get every scientist to accept that theory as true, that turns that theory into a law, and that would be the law of gravity. I know this was a lot of information. I know I went kind of fast. Make sure to rewatch the video and make sure to ask all of the questions that you have and any comments or concerns that you have after watching this video. I hope you took good notes, and I hope that you learned something.